Hi debaters, this is the third and final video on the topic of topicality. And this video is all about how to answer topicality arguments when you are affirmative. But first, I have a joke for you. Once upon a time, a negative team asked in cross-examination whether the affirmative plan used any papayas to solve the harms. The affirmative speaker said no. The negative then asked if any pineapples were used in the plan text. Again, the affirmative speaker said no. Finally, the negative speaker inquired as to the number of bananas required by the affirmative plan. Exasperated, the affirmative speaker said no papayas, pineapples, or bananas were used at all in the affirmative plan. Well then, said the negative team, clearly your affirmative plan is untropical. Okay, so let's move on to answering topicality. The good news is that answering topicality when you are the affirmative team is fairly straightforward. Assuming the negative topicality argument follows the traditional structure of interpretation, violation, standards, and voters, your responses as the affirmative team should follow the same order. They might have a few subpoints under each section, and so should you. They might have a few standards, and you should at least have one response to each standard, maybe some of your own. The same is true for voters. Let's start with interpretation, which is really just another word for the dictionary definition. Think of it as this way. The interpretation is how you interpret or define a specific word or phrase in the resolution. Since the only thing you do in the interpretation section is read a definition, then the terms interpretation and definition are nearly interchangeable. So in the interpretation section, the negative team read a dictionary definition. The first response from the affirmative team should be the words "we meet." These two little words are so common that they are the first words in about 95% of affirmative responses to topicality. By saying "we meet," you are saying that your plan fits within or meets the interpretation offered by the negative team. Now you can't just say "we meet." You have to explain how your plan fits within the definition offered by the negative team. So how does the affirmative plan meet the negative interpretation? Well, most dictionary definitions are vague enough that there's lots of wiggle room. Take this definition of substantially from Merriam-Webster's.com. Substantially, in a way that is large enough to be noticed or have an effect. That's a very vague definition, and the affirmative team could easily argue that their plan would be noticed or have an effect. So the affirmative plan meets the negative interpretation. That's why negative teams really want to keep searching until they find definitions that are narrow and specific enough to exclude most affirmative plans. So what does the affirmative team do if the negative interpretation obviously excludes the affirmative to the point where the affirmative plan can't meet the interpretation? Well, the affirmative team offers a counter-interpretation, which means that you read a definition of the same word, and preferably one that is more favorable to the affirmative plan. But guess what? Even if the affirmative plan totally fits within the definition read by the negative team, the affirmative will still want to offer a counter-interpretation because that increases the chances of winning the round. So, you have two goals as the affirmative team when answering the interpretation section. Say "we meet" and offer a counter-interpretation. Let's move on to the violation, and here is where you will explain why your plan is topical based on all the definitions that are in play. You'll want to explain why your plan is topical under the interpretation they read, and you'll want to explain why your plan is topical under the interpretation you read. This makes it appear like no matter what definition the judge prefers, your plan is still topical. Now we get to the standards and voters. It is easy when you first get started with debate to overlook the standards and voters, and they can be admittedly confusing. So we'll try to make it simple. Nevertheless, there is much work to be done in these last two sections. So let's start with standards. Your goal in the standards section is much like your goal in the interpretation section. To whatever extent possible, you want to demonstrate that the original standards read by the negative team support your affirmative plan, and you want to read a few counter standards as well. So, if you are confused up to this point, let's switch gears and offer an analogy that might help. You enter a cookie contest and present what you think are the best darn chocolate chip cookies I've ever made. And you know the judge will choose the most satisfying cookie. We'll say that's the word in the resolution you are trying to meet. But your opponent claims that the satisfaction of a cookie is defined by taste. That's their interpretation. And they say we can measure how tasty a cookie is by the sweetness, the saltiness, and the richness. These are their standards. So your job is to A, say that your cookies are indeed tasty. That's your way of meeting their interpretation. And B, go one step further and say that a satisfying cookie should really be defined by its texture. That's your counter-interpretation. Now it's time to dive into their standards. They claim that the best measure of a cookie is sweetness, saltiness, and richness. In this part of the debate, your job is to prove that cookies are sweet, salty, and rich. But you also want to say that there are other better ways to measure a cookie, including softness, crispiness on the outside, and chewiness all around. Note that these counter standards reinforce your counter interpretation of texture. Okay, Back to our regularly scheduled discussion. At this point in the topicality debate, the affirmative team's responses should have mitigated the negative team's definition, offered a better definition, mitigated the negative team's standards, and offered better standards. There are a few affirmative standards that work particularly well in countering the negative team's standards. Use these responses as needed to show that the negative team's standards are unreasonable. The first is lit checks abuse. That's a fancy way of saying that since the negative team read a lot of evidence or literature in response to your plan, then your plan couldn't have been so abusively untopical. This argument works particularly well with the predictability and limits standards because it shows that the negative team obviously researched and prepared for your affirmative plan, which is proof that your plan was predictable. The same is true for clash checks abuse, which argues that since the negative team made several substantive arguments in their 1NC, then there is adequate ground for both teams. The third argument is to say that there is no in-round abuse, which means that the negative team has not demonstrated how the affirmative plan is so abusive that it somehow unfairly disadvantages them. So the judge should presume that it's a fair round. Finally, we move to voters. In the negative team's original topicality argument, voters are reasons why topicality is so important that it should be prioritized over all other arguments. You learned in previous videos that topicality is an a priori issue, which means that it should be settled first, and voters are the reasons why. When responding to the voters section, the affirmative team should be prepared to argue that topicality is not a voting issue. This means mitigating the voters given by the negative team and offering a few additional reasons why topicality isn't the most important issue in the round. You can mitigate the existing voters by essentially saying, yes, education, fairness, and jurisdiction are important to the world of debate, and our affirmative plan, counter-interpretation, counter-standards all demonstrate how we not only make the round more educational for everyone involved, we also make it more fair. Moreover, we don't fall outside the jurisdiction of the resolution, so we protect that too. When offering additional reasons why topicality isn't the most important issue in the round, the affirmative team can claim that definitions are vague, out of context, and cannot be used as a reason to vote for or against a team. Moreover, the definitions don't decide whether a plan is topical or not. The judge does. And if the affirmative team has presented a reasonably affirmative case, then they should not be held to an extreme voting standard that punishes them for not meeting every conceivable definition of the word. Okay, so that wraps up our discussion of how the affirmative team should respond to the four sections of a topicality argument: interpretation, violation, standards, and voters. Responding to topicality is pretty easy once you get the hang of it, but it may take a few ugly rounds before you're able to consistently keep all the argumentation organized. Remember that the key is to constantly predict what the opposing team will say in response and have your own responses pre-written and ready to go. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.